Ani, bienvenue, welcome. I'm Dr. Lisa Porter, Executive Director of WeSpark Health Institute, and I'm thrilled to launch today's webinar focused on a very important topic that's near and dear to all of our hearts, the COVID-19 vaccine. Before we begin, it's important to acknowledge that while we are standing on land that all has a different story, we here in Windsor reside on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of the First Nations. While their story is not mine to tell, I'm learning that throughout history, the Three Fires were comprised of different nations of people that not only celebrated their differences, they relied on them. They established a common language and laws and worked together to be collectively stronger. Our nation is only slowly acknowledging the richness and importance of the history that's buried in our lands. During this global pandemic, we as individuals were put into a position to trust our leaders and to make great sacrifices for our communities, not only our friends and our families, but strangers, and especially the vulnerable populations. I think that we would all agree, based on our experiences, that we not only have a lot to learn about the First Nations peoples, but we could learn a lot from them. Today's event was initiated and organized and will be delivered by a talented group of students from the University of Windsor's Faculty of Science and supported by the staff at WeSpark. WeSpark is a unique partnership between the University of Windsor, St. Clair College, Windsor Regional Hospital, and the Hotel de Grace Healthcare. WeSpark unites, supports the strength of each of these institutions, and creates efficiencies to elevate our health research ecosystem. You might be wondering, why would I care about research? Why is it important for the discussion here today? And the reason for that is that medical research attracts the best and the brightest and transforms our healthcare culture and landscape. You'll witness from our expert panel today that researchers work at the cutting edge of their field, and they have the latest knowledge that a topic is able to deliver. Researchers also use expertise to find answers to our toughest problems like finding a vaccine for COVID-19 and determining its safety. Research delivers the knowledge that we need to understand and how to approach our healthcare challenges, and it also aids in rapid adoption of best prevention and care practices. WeSpark just launched in March 2020. I invite you to read about our successes in that first year in our impact report and through our quarterly reports indicated here on the website. You can also join us as a membership. So whether you're a researcher or a student or a community member, there's a level of membership for everyone. So please look on the website to see and join us. How things are going to work today is that our students will be hosting the event, and they will be asking questions to our experts, questions that were delivered when you registered for the event. So these are common questions that we are hearing again and again on social media. And while you're streaming live on Facebook, I invite you to ask your questions on Facebook Live. And if we're not able to address them here in the event today, we will be sure to get to you. So I want to say a welcome and a thank you to all of our panelists for being here today. Dr. Philip Karpowicz, who's a stem cell scientist in biomedical sciences at the University of Windsor. Dr. John Trant, who's a bioorganic chemist in the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry at the University of Windsor. Dr. Munir Rahim, who's an immunologist in biomedical sciences at the University of Windsor. Dr. Corrina, who's head of infectious disease at Windsor Regional Hospital. And Dr. Wajid Ahmed, who's medical officer at Windsor-Essex County Health Unit. Sorry about that. And so without further ado, I'm going to invite our first student host, Paige Brown, from the Biological Sciences program. So Paige is an undergraduate student at the University of Windsor. Paige.
Thank you so much for that great introduction, Dr. Porter. So to start, our first panelist today is Dr. Phil Karpovic, who is a stem cell biologist and an associate professor in the Department of Biomedical Sciences at the University of Windsor. Dr. Karpovic received his PhD from the University of Toronto and completed his postdoctoral work at Harvard Medical School under Dr. Norbert Perriman. Today, he will address some of the questions surrounding the basic biology behind the COVID-19 vaccines. So to start us off, with the introduction of these vaccines, the term mRNA has been used to describe the technology being used in the COVID-19 vaccines. For those who are not familiar with this term, can you explain what is mRNA?
Sure. So most of us have heard about DNA. Our genes are found in our DNA. They're like messages. They're writing that's made up of the different chemicals that compose DNA. RNA is the same message using a different chemical that's basically copied from this DNA writing. The M in mRNA stands for messenger. It's a copy of the same message that comes from genes, but it's using RNA instead of DNA. So mRNA is used to make a protein. The protein itself is a basic building block of our body, and in fact, it's the basic building block of all living things. The mRNA is actually a temporary code that's normally taken from the DNA and used to make this building block. RNA is actually very unstable. It disappears very quickly from the environment and also from our body.
Okay, awesome. That's great to know. So to build on that last question, could you tell us, how does an mRNA vaccine work?
Sure. So I'll just briefly and very quickly, I'll describe it. mRNA is basically made in an industrial lab, and then it's packaged into small bubbles, which you may have heard the name nanoparticles, and that makes the actual vaccine. It has RNA inside it and this bubble on the outside. And immune cells in your body will take up this bubble and they'll make proteins out of it. And they use those proteins to actually prevent infections. So for COVID vaccines, the mRNA is the same message or as the proteins that make up the actual virus. If you were normally sick with a COVID, your immune cells would use destroyed virus proteins to protect you from a second infection. But in this case, this mRNA vaccine essentially shortcuts that whole process. It makes the virus protein in the immune cells of your body without an infection actually happening, and you're immune without having ever been infected. So like I mentioned, the RNA itself is very unstable. In fact, that's why you need these powerful freezers to distribute some of the vaccines, like the Pfizer vaccine that you may read about in the news. The freezers keep this RNA vaccine cold, and then they make it more stable than it would be at room temperature. It's stable enough to start this immunity in your body, but it will disappear very quickly after that.
Awesome, that's really interesting. Okay, so to move to our next question, we'd like to know, can an mRNA vaccine change your DNA?
Nope, not at all. mRNA doesn't make any mutations or changes to your DNA. Like I mentioned, RNA is very temporary and it's very unstable. So once it's used up by the immune cells taking up this vaccine, that it will disappear and it will go away.
Okay, that's great to know. Okay, so as we know, the mRNA vaccine technology created by companies such as Pfizer and Mrna is a new development and is not the same as an attenuated virus vaccine used to prevent illnesses such as measles or the influenza. What is unique about an mRNA vaccine compared with an attenuated virus vaccine?
Yeah, so this is a new technology and it's very amazing, actually. And I think one of the most important things about it is that it's flexible, right? So you, like I mentioned, the RNA is it's like a message, it's a code, and you can change that code easily, and you can make new vaccines easily. So if you need to do this, it's a lot easier to change an mRNA vaccine to respond to a new variant of something like COVID. For instance, a new variant that arises from people traveling, or one that arises in Canada here. Using an old technology like an attenuated vaccine, you have to start again from the beginning to make a vaccine that's actually effective against that variant. But with mRNA vaccine technology, you just have to change the RNA sequence and everything else stays the same. The whole packaging process that I described stays exactly the same, and you can have a new vaccine much faster.
Okay, so I guess that actually ties in really well to our last question for you. So we ask, will vaccines in the future continue using mRNA technology?
I mean, this is just my opinion, but I think absolutely this is a game changer for vaccine technology, I think. It's going to help us fight COVID and the new variants that are arising. But also, you know, this new technology is applicable to any virus, anything really, and we can make vaccines really fast. And we can make them very, very specific for something new that's dangerous. And we can teach our cells in our body without ever having been infected how to resist this new thing.
That's amazing. It sounds like this technology is really innovative and incredible. So I guess that's our last question for you. So again, we want to thank you so much for joining us today and answering some questions about the basic biology of these COVID-19 vaccines. I would now like to introduce our next interviewer, Isabel Hinch, who is a first-year master's student working under Dr. Lisa Porter, who will be speaking with Dr. John Trant about the biochemical composition of the COVID-19 vaccines.
Thank you, Paige, and thanks to our audience for submitting the questions that we will talk about in this next segment. And in this segment, we are going to explore the more chemical, maybe, aspects of the vaccine and basically take a look at what is inside of it. And I have the honor of being joined by Dr. John Trant, an assistant professor at the University of Windsor's Chemistry and Biochemistry Department. Dr. Trant received his doctorate of chemistry at the University of Ottawa and was a postdoctorate fellow at Brock University. Here in Windsor, he heads a research group that works to apply synthetic organic chemistry tools to answer questions in biological, medical, and material sciences. And in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, he and his team have stepped up to the challenge and shifted gears to tackle this virus by working on various different projects locally, from the local production of hand sanitizer to vaccine efficiency tests. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Trant. Hi, Dr. Trant.
Hi.
And
great, thank you. That was a wonderful introduction.
Of course. And thank you for making yourself available to answer these questions for us. And I'd like to start off by recognizing that we live in a very informed society. People like to know what's in their products, what they're putting into their bodies. You go to the store and you could read all the ingredients off of the label, from food to cosmetics. And that might be a little bit harder to do with a vaccine. And it has led to some concerns and claims, maybe online, that have gained a lot of attention. You've probably heard there are microchips in the vaccines that some people like to float. And no matter how outrageous these claims may seem, they are still valid concerns that can be addressed. And so I'd like maybe just to start off, thinking of this ingredient list for the vaccine, if you will. What ingredients are used in the vaccine? What's in it?
So we kind of have sort of two different sets of vaccines that are currently kind of coming out. So we have, on one hand, we have the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine. And that's what we were just talking about, is the mRNA-based vaccines. So in these ones, this is a completely new technology. People have been talking about this for a while, but this is really the first time we're seeing this come out. And so the way these work is inside basically an oil droplet, and it's very, very specific what the fats are that are making up the oil droplet. So it's, you take olive oil, you take water, you put the olive oil in the water, and you'll see that you'll get little droplets of the oil in here. Well, both Moderna and Pfizer have picked very, very specific mixtures of oils to make very, very small particles on the order of about 50 to 100 nanometers. And they have the mRNA in them, and the choice of the oils make sure that you get the right size, you get the same size every time, and that they stay stable, and that they enter certain cells and they don't degrade as soon as they enter the body. And so very, very specific choices of oils. Then along with that, we have the mRNA, and I'm going to leave it to my expert colleague who was just talking about what that mRNA is, and I'm a chemist, not a biologist, so I'll leave that to him. But that's in there as well. And then we have a few other stabilizing agents. So the problem is that the inside of that capsule needs to be about the same density and strength and content, and it needs to look like the stuff on the outside once it's in your bloodstream. Otherwise, it will fall apart really quickly. And so what we do is we add some salts in there. So the salts that we're seeing, for example, in the Pfizer vaccine, is they're adding a little bit of potassium chloride, they add a little bit of potassium phosphate, a little bit of table salt, which is sodium chloride. And all these different salts are doing two things. They're making sure there's enough salt in there so that we don't suck water in or suck water out, so that the particle stays the same size. And they also make sure that the pH remains balanced. And then the final thing that they're also adding in is a little bit of sugar. And what the sugar does is it makes sure that we're not freezing these compounds. And when you freeze them, that the inside of that, the mRNA is protected and it doesn't get damaged by ice crystals. Because if the mRNA gets really damaged by ice crystals, it'll get destroyed when you freeze these. And the problem with the mRNA is that it's really, really unstable. It breaks down quickly at room temperature. So we do need to freeze them, but the risk of freezing them is you damage the mRNA. So it's a very, very careful formulation there. On the other type of vaccine, that's the one that we're getting from Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca, the Oxford vaccine. Those are using a viral vector. Now, they're not attenuated viruses, which is the way that we used to make vaccines, which was a slower process. You have to get a version of COVID-19, you have to neuter it, you have to use it. What we're doing here is we're putting in that spike protein signal into another type of virus that is really good at entering the cells, but is also completely safe. And we don't need to redesign a new virus every time. We can use this one virus. For example, the AstraZeneca team has been using this to make Ebola vaccines and to make Zika virus vaccines. So they've been sort of spinning out the same vector time and time again to use it for that. And all that's in there really is they've got this little virus particle with all the dangerous stuff cut out of it. And the only piece of genetic material that's really in there is the signal to make this protein that's found on the COVID-19 virus. So it's just a virus. Yeah. So very simple ingredients actually in these vaccines.
Yeah, so what I'm gathering is just kind of oil, some salts, recycled materials from old vaccines. Sounds very organic almost. So not as scary.
It is actually pretty organic. Yeah.
And so just to clear the air, there are no microchips in the vaccine, correct?
There are no microchips. I would be incredibly happy if I could make a microchip small enough, because I do try and do this. This is part of our research, and it's part of the cutting edge. And I'd be super happy if I could make a microchip small enough to get into one of these things. It's not currently possible. So I can confirm that there are no microchips in there. That's just not possible to do.
Thank you. And we talked a bit about the two different types of vaccines that are making the rounds right now on the ground. What are because we talked about a bit the one needing to be refrigerated. What are really the chemical or biochemical differences between these two?
Yeah, so Pfizer and Moderna have this big difference. They're both these mRNA vaccines, but the Pfizer vaccine needs to be kept at minus 90 degrees Celsius in these really expensive, high important freezers, whereas the Moderna vaccine can be stored in a normal freezer. And that's just completely by the choice of those oils. Moderna has spent an awful lot of time really making sure that it chooses oils that remain stable at minus 20, whereas Pfizer has moved a lot faster to pivot towards this. This is a new technology for them. And so what they've done is they haven't quite optimized that to the same degree. So they're working with a slightly less stable formulation. It needs to be kept colder.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
And coming back to this idea of ingredient list, I'll just maybe throw out there some specific components that kept coming up. One question that had come up was, why would a vaccine contain sugar?
Yeah, so that comes back to protecting it from freezing. Because again, with this mRNA, when you freeze something, you make ice crystals. My PhD is actually in thawing of ice crystals. And so as you thaw it, ice crystals get bigger, and those can damage materials. They can damage the mRNA because the ice crystals expand, they damage the molecules. And so what the sugar does is it makes sure the ice crystals don't really expand as you thaw this stuff to put it in. So we keep it nice, the crystals nice and small, so we reduce damage, so you keep your mRNA active. If you don't have that in there, you can get an awful lot of ice damage, and your mRNA will not be very active once you thaw it.
Okay. And the next component, we might have talked about this, but maybe it's good to define this term. Why does the vaccine require lipid nanoparticles?
So the idea there is, as we were talking about, if I just take mRNA and I inject that into your bloodstream, it's gone immediately. Like it's destroyed immediately. Your body is really good at destroying any loose mRNA because we don't want that happening. We don't want mRNA escaping your cells and doing anything. So what we need to do is we need to protect that. And so what we're making are they're oil and water droplets, and they're protecting the mRNA inside from all the enzymes that want to destroy it. And so what that makes happen, though, is that oil droplet can fuse with the surface of your cell and deposit its contents into the cell, which is the mRNA. And so what we're doing here is we're taking advantage of the fact that these specific oils that these companies are using are good at targeting specific cells and surviving a specific time period to deliver their cargo. and we want these particles very small. So we're using these lipid nanoparticles for that.
So big words for tiny, tiny little things inside of these vaccines.
Yes.
And the final one that I have here on my list, I know when it comes to food, sometimes people tend to cower from hearing this and they might seem scary, but does the vaccine contain any preservatives?
Sort of depends what you mean by a preservative. So when we're breaking it down, like a preservative protects the thing from being destroyed. And what we're seeing with all of these is these are protected by being frozen. So we have this sugar in here that's protecting them from freezing. But we're not seeing a lot of these standard preservatives that we think of when we think of protecting from bacteria growth. Like that's what most preservatives do, is they make sure the bacteria can't grow in something. And that's not present in these. These are created under incredibly sterile environments. So they're kept sealed and protected. So we're using that, like physical controls, to block any bacteria from getting in there. So there are no traditional preservatives in these vaccines. They are just being protected from thawing and freezing.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Those are all the questions that I had lined up for now. I know I have learned so much. Chemistry is not my field of expertise, so this has been really interesting. And thank you for answering these questions and taking them seriously and taking the time to be here, Dr. Trant. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'd like to pass it on now to Kathiani, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Windsor in Biological Sciences, to continue with these conversations. Kathiani.
Thank you, Isabel. For this next segment, we will address questions related to immunity. To answer these questions, I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Munir Rahim. Dr. Rahim received his doctoral training at McGill before completing his postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Ottawa. He is currently a professor of immunology in the Department of Biomedical Sciences at the University of Windsor. Dr. Rahim's research expertise includes tumor immunology and virus infections. Thank you very much, Dr. Rahim, for taking the time to join us here today.
Thank you for the introduction.
I'd like to begin just with a general question. How do vaccines give you immunity?
That's a very good question. So there are two main properties of our immune system that is important to know when we discuss vaccines. One is the ability of our immune system to distinguish what is self and what is non-self. So by non-self, I mean anything that enters our body from outside. So our immune system is very good at recognizing what is foreign to the body, and it will react against it and will try to remove it from the body. So in case of COVID-19 or the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the proteins that come with the virus, that are part of the virus, those are the things that our immune system recognizes. They get activated and they produce antibodies to clear those proteins and the pathogen from the body. The second important property of the immune system is that it forms what we call immunological memory. After seeing an infection or an infectious particle for the first time, it learns how to fight that infection and it remembers that. So some of those immune cells that fought the infection and cleared the infection, they form a pool of immunologically memory cells. And they react much faster and stronger against subsequent infection when they encounter this pathogen a second time, or then our immune cells know how to fight this infection and they become activated much faster and they will have a much stronger response to clear this infection. What the vaccines do is to expose the immune system to these proteins from a pathogen. We call these the antigens. So the vaccines deliver these proteins that are from the pathogen, and they expose the immune system to these proteins so that the immune system knows how to recognize these antigen when a real infection takes place. So immune system recognizes those foreign proteins, get activated, and produces an immune response, and then they form a memory of that response. So when we get exposed to the pathogen in a real infection, our immune system already knows how to recognize the proteins from that pathogen and how to fight that infection. So basically, an immune system, a vaccine trains our immune system how to recognize a pathogen without causing the infection.
So Dr. Rahim, you mentioned that these vaccines give us immunity by helping us remember exactly and training us for this actual meeting with the COVID virus. So is this why we need 2 doses of this vaccine before it's effective?
Okay, so every time that our immune cells or those memory immune cells encounter the pathogen, their response becomes stronger and they get better at fighting the infection. So the first dose is to begin that immune response, begin that phase of when the immune cells become activated and learn how to fight this new protein that they're exposed to. And then they develop this immunological memory. The second dose that we get is to strengthen that immunological memory, to make it more efficient at fighting the infection.
So once we do get both of these doses, how long will it take for the vaccine to allow our body to build up immunity? And how long will it last once we do have this immunity?
So the first part of question, how fast do we get immunized against the infection after vaccination? So in the clinical trials that were done with the Mrna and the Pfizer vaccines, which are approved for use in Canada, they saw protection within 2 weeks after vaccination. So in the first, when the volunteers who participated in these trials got their vaccines, there were a group of volunteers who got a placebo vaccine. They act as control, so they don't receive the vaccine. And both in the placebo control group and those who were vaccinated, the rate of infection is similar in the first 2 weeks. Only after 2 weeks, the rate of infection falls in the vaccinated group. So that shows that it takes about 2 weeks before the immunity kicks in, and this can protect the vaccinated group from getting infection. Regarding the question about how long this will last, so we don't know yet. These are the questions that will be answered as the participants of these clinical trials will be followed over months and years from now. Usually, the immunity that we receive depends on the infection or the type of the vaccine or the antigens that were used. In some cases, like the smallpox vaccine, for example, this vaccine gives us lifelong immunity. Even after 30 years, you can detect those antibodies that this vaccine induced. Other vaccines, for example, tetanus vaccine, doesn't give us lifelong immunity, and so we have to get our vaccination again after a certain period of time. In case of COVID-19, we don't have those answers yet. So we will have to wait till those participants are analyzed again and to see how fast this response, how long this response lasts in these individuals.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rahim, for your answer. Briefly, there's some concern with the new variants of the COVID virus. One has been discovered in the UK and another in South Africa. Now, they mentioned that the virus is mutating, and the concern regarding the vaccine is if it will be effective against these new variants of the COVID virus. Could you briefly tell us how a virus mutates and if the vaccine will be effective?
Yeah, sure. So like any living thing or living cell, the virus has to make copies of its genetic material. In the case of COVID-19, it's an RNA virus, so it makes copies of its RNA to produce new viral particles and increase the virus titer. This process of copying the genetic material is done by a protein which is an enzyme that makes basically reads the sequence of the mRNA genome of the virus and makes a copy of it. In case of the coronavirus 2 that causes COVID-19, it carries its own enzyme that makes copies of the RNA genome, but this enzyme makes error when it makes a copy of the RNA genome. So those errors that it introduces in the new copies of the viral genome, that's what we call mutation. And that can change the nature of the viral proteins. It could increase their infectivity and virulence, but it can also decrease the fitness of those virus. Only the ones that increase the fitness of the virus, make it more virulent, are the one that we see because those are the viruses that can replicate and infect more cells and become more prevalent in the society. Regarding the effectiveness of the vaccine against the new variants, so this is, of course, of concern at the moment. Again, we don't have the proper trials done to see how effective these vaccines are going to be against the variants. There are some laboratory experiments done to check the antibodies that are induced by these vaccines, how effective are at preventing infection of cells in petri dishes by these viruses. And there seems to be, particularly in the case of the South African variant, that there is some reduction in the efficacy of these antibodies in preventing an infection of cells in culture. Roughly by 2/3 reduction in their efficacy. Whether this reduction affects the overall efficacy of the vaccine in providing protection, we don't know yet. Maybe the level of affinity of the antibodies against the new virus that we see in laboratory experiments, maybe that is still enough to provide some protection, but those we will not know until proper clinical trials are conducted in areas where these new variants are prevalent to see if these vaccines can provide protection against those variants.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rahim, for answering all of these questions. I think we'll continue now with the next segment. For the next segment, the host will be Sevda, a third-year undergraduate researcher in the Behavior, Cognition, and Neuroscience program. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy Annie, for that wonderful introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Sevda, and today I have the honor of interviewing Dr. Corrina today to take a look at a little bit more of the clinical aspects of the COVID-19 vaccine. Dr. Kwan is the infectious disease specialist at Windsor Regional Hospital and at Hotel du Grace Healthcare. She completed her formal education at the University of Toronto and did her fellowship in infectious diseases at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center in Seattle, Washington. Thank you for being here with us today, Dr. Kwan. We're very lucky to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So to start off, to get into the questions, there's a little bit of confusion amongst the population of how vaccination works in relation to people who have already been infected with COVID-19. If someone has already been infected, do they still need to get the vaccine?
Yes, they do. As Dr. Rahim mentioned with immunity, we don't know how long, if someone has had the infection, how long they will be protected from future infection, how long the antibodies will last at that time. And also there have been reports of people having reinfection, so a second infection with COVID-19. So the vaccine just gives additional protection. So again, we don't know how long the vaccine is going to last for, but it builds upon the protection that you've already developed from having natural infection.
Interesting. There's also been some interest in what happens when you actually do take the vaccine and for people who have already received it. Are there found to be any serious side effects from the vaccine, and are people going to be monitored after they receive it?
Yes, so there are sort of minor, what we call minor side effects that occur in a number of people. So this is kind of pain at the site of the injection, maybe chills or fever, headache, fatigue. And that usually lasts a day or two and should go away. And it's not, very serious. I think the more serious possible side effects are the allergic reactions that people have heard about on the news. There were 2 healthcare workers in Britain in December that had an anaphylaxis reaction to the vaccine. So that has, caused a lot of concern. So with those 2 people, apparently they had a lot of allergies to other things, and they did carry an epinephrine pen, which is something that you would carry if you have an anaphylaxis to treat yourself if you did develop an anaphylaxis reaction. So in Canada, they do monitor reactions, and the latest information from the Health Canada website is that there's been about 1.1 million doses of vaccine given, and there have been about 600 side effects reported to Health Canada, and about 99 of these are considered serious. So that includes the anaphylaxis. So the risk is quite low, and anaphylaxis can occur with any vaccine, not just the COVID vaccine. So that is a possibility, but the rate is quite low. And after you get your vaccine, you're monitored for 15 minutes afterwards to monitor to see if you have any immediate side effects from the vaccine.
Interesting. So we did receive a lot of questions in relation to the vaccine and allergies. So just to kind of stem off of what you just said, for people who do have allergies, they're wondering, should they avoid the vaccine, or would you say it's safe all around for them to take it anyways?
So right now, the only contraindication, meaning you should not get the vaccine, is if you have an allergy to any of the components of the vaccine. And I think Dr. Trant went through a lot of the different things that are in the vaccine. So if you know that you have an allergy, you should not get the vaccine. And the components of the vaccine are listed on the Health Canada website and also on the vaccine monographs. If you have a lot of allergies to food or other drugs, or if you've had allergies or serious reactions to other vaccines, then the best thing is probably to discuss this with your healthcare provider to determine what your risk is, and in terms of the vaccine, and also risk of getting COVID before making a decision. But right now, that is not a contraindication to getting the COVID vaccine unless you have allergies to any of the components. Or if you had a reaction to the first dose of the COVID vaccine, then you should not get the second dose.
Interesting. Okay. So at this point, a lot of the talk about the vaccine is really about whether or not people should take it, the actions that kind of come with taking it right beforehand. But some of the concern comes around the long-term effects. So how can we be sure that there will be no severe long-term effects from taking the vaccine?
Okay, so with any vaccine, after it's been approved, Health Canada continues to follow to see whether there are any reported side effects from the vaccine or any drug that's approved as well. So there is a reporting system in place for physicians to report if their patients have any symptoms. So if you received the vaccine and you had more prolonged side effects or something that came up that you might think might be associated that's not reported, you should see your healthcare provider, and your healthcare provider can submit a report to the health unit, which then is passed on to Health Canada, and all that information is tracked. Also, when the vaccine is approved, the Pfizer and Mrna, they have to agree that they will report any changes in side effects, the vaccine quality, or effectiveness after it has been marketed. So there's the post-marketing information that we obtain after things have been approved. So there is a way to find out if there's any long-term side effects from the vaccine.
Okay, interesting. Thank you for that. To kind of stem off of the topic of side effects, another concern that was raised by the public is more so in regards to the vaccine and fertility. Is it possible for the vaccine to result in side effects that would cause issues in fertility? And should mothers who are currently expecting or are breastfeeding avoid it, or are they still okay to take the vaccine?
Okay, so I'll address the pregnancy breastfeeding first. So in the two studies of Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, pregnant women or breastfeeding women were excluded from being in the trial. So there is no information on safety data or effectiveness of the vaccine in pregnant women or breastfeeding women. And we don't know what the effect the vaccine might have on the infant that's breastfeeding or on milk production and things like that. However, again, it's a risk benefit. Vaccines are generally safe in pregnancy, and we do recommend influenza vaccination for pregnant women. We do know that COVID infection in pregnant women is more severe compared to non-pregnant women. So they're more likely to have more severe symptoms, more likely to require hospitalization, more likely to require ICU care or mechanical ventilation, and even death. And also there may be, effects on the pregnancy itself, like increased preterm labor from COVID infection. So there is increased risk to pregnant women. So right now we don't have that information, but again, it's a discussion you can have with your healthcare provider. The latest recommendations from the Society of Obstetrics and Gynecologists of Canada do recommend that vaccination should be offered to pregnant women and breastfeeding women, and it's not a contraindication. So again, it's a discussion about the risk versus the benefit.
Interesting, for sure. So could you tell us a little bit how the vaccine kind of plays a part in for people who already have underlying health conditions, such as diabetes or heart problems, or even those who are immunocompromised? Is it still okay for them to take the vaccine?
So again, the studies did not include people that were immunocompromised or on immunosuppressive medications. So again, there isn't any information on safety data or the effectiveness of the vaccine in this population. However, and for the autoimmune, there were some people with autoimmune disease, but low numbers, and they didn't give all that information in the study that was published. So this group of people is at increased risk for more severe disease. So I know it's they're not on the list to get vaccinated, but when it's offered to the general population, they should get vaccinated as well. But knowing that their response to the vaccine may be lower than someone that is not on immunosuppressive drugs or is not immunocompromised. So the protection may not be as good as in someone that doesn't have those problems.
Thank you.
So can I, sorry, just interrupt. I forgot to mention about the infertility aspect for the last question, if I can go back. So I think there was a concern about infertility caused by the vaccine, and that seemed to be promoted through social media by a German physician and an ex-employee of Pfizer who raised the possibility that the vaccine might cause problems with a protein called syncytin-1, which is a protein in the placenta and is important in development of the placenta and attachment of the placenta during pregnancy. So it's a very important protein. However, that placental protein and the spike protein of COVID-19 that the antibodies are produced against are not the same protein. So there's no reason to think that the vaccine would cause antibodies that would react against the syncytin. And also in the Pfizer trial, 12 women became pregnant after they received the vaccination. So those women are being followed for any long-term side effects. So there doesn't appear to be any evidence that there's any effect on fertility from the vaccine.
Thank you for clearing up. That's very interesting. Another question regarding existing health concerns. Some individuals have been told that they're on the do not vaccinate list. For example, people with rheumatoid arthritis. Is there a particular reason why they're on this list? And do you see the possibility of a status change for them in the future?
Yes, I think the main reason they're on the new do not vaccinate list was because that population, people on immunosuppressive drugs or people that are immunosuppressed, were not included in the studies for the vaccine. But there's no contraindication really to giving it to people with autoimmune or immunocompromised conditions. It's just that they may not react as well, produce as good an antibody response as someone that doesn't have those conditions.
Interesting, thank you. As we know, there are already some vaccines that are available to the population today. Would you say that it's okay to take another vaccine, such as the one for shingles, at the same time as a COVID vaccine, or should vaccinations be separated?
Yes, so right now, vaccination should be, the vaccine should be separated. We don't know what effect other vaccines might have on the COVID vaccine efficacy, so it's best to not give it with another vaccine. It's recommended that you wait at least 14 days from when you received a previous vaccine, before you get the COVID vaccine, or if you've gotten the COVID vaccine, to wait at least 14 days until you get another vaccine. However, if you need to get a vaccine, like tetanus, if you had a dirty injury and you needed the tetanus shot, then you should go ahead and get the tetanus shot. So in certain circumstances, it would be okay to get another vaccine, but only if it's really necessary. But in general, you should not.
Okay, interesting. That's good to know. Stemming off of the same idea, at this point, another really common thing in the population is antibiotic prescriptions. So is it okay to take the vaccine if you are on prescription medication like antibiotics?
So my opinion is that, if you're on antibiotics, you're on it for an infection, a bacterial infection. So you may have a fever, you may not be feeling well. In that situation, you should not get the COVID vaccine. You should not get any, vaccine. So normally when you get any vaccination, you should be feeling well, no fever, things like that. So it's probably best to wait till you finished your antibiotics and the infection is gone before you get your vaccination.
Thank you. So my last question is just again about medication. Should people who are on medication avoid taking it before they go to receive their vaccine, or does that have a major effect?
So I think the question was more for like aspirin or anti-inflammatories, and yeah, for prevention of fever or the effects of the vaccine. So generally, we don't recommend that you take anything beforehand because it may interfere again with the vaccine. But after you have the vaccine, if you do have fever or headache or muscle aches, then you could take, Tylenol or an anti-inflammatory to treat the symptoms.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Kwan, for all of your amazing and informative answers. It was a pleasure to be able to interview, and I learned a lot myself, and I hope that all of our viewers also learned a lot.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. With that being said, we'll move on to the last interview segment of this webinar, which will be conducted by Zainab, who is a PhD student in the Biological Sciences Department at the University of Windsor, working in Dr. Karpovich's lab. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Savda and Dr. Kwan, for that amazing interview. I definitely learned a lot myself. And for this final segment of the webinar, we will be discussing the questions submitted by our viewers related to public health and the efficacy of the COVID vaccine. Joining me to answer these questions is Dr. Wajid Ahmed, the Medical Officer of Health with the Windsor-Essex County Health Unit. Dr. Ahmed received his medical training in Pakistan. He started his public health education at the University of Waterloo and completed his public health and preventive medicine residency at the University of Ottawa. And over the past year, Dr. Ahmed has been our local authority helping our city safely navigate its way through this pandemic. Dr. Ahmed, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So to begin our discussion, let's talk about this increased trend in vaccine hesitancy that we see on a global scale as well as in our own communities. What effects could this have moving forward?
So what I see is, I guess we can say that we are a victim of our own success. The vaccines have basically eradicated many of the diseases in this world, and we don't see the deaths and hospitalization associated with due to many of these vaccines, which are readily available everywhere. We don't see people dying from measles. We don't see people dying from meningitis, and the vaccine has been regarded as one of the top 10 achievements in the modern public health world. What is causing this is when people are not seeing what we are preventing, some of them feel that maybe we don't need those vaccines. We always need these vaccines unless we completely get rid of all these circulating viruses or bacteria from this world, which we haven't done that except for smallpox. So for all the rest of the viruses and bacteria that are circulating, we are basically controlling them and making sure that they do not spread in enough population to cause massive disease. And the vaccines are basically preventing that. And as a result of that, when people are not seeing that, they think that the disease is gone. The disease is not gone. The moment we stop vaccinating people, it will come back fast and furious. We have seen some of the incidents in previous years when large measles outbreak in US and in some other countries, in European countries, where there was a low uptake of vaccines in these areas. I hope that we don't have to see those diseases again before people realize that we all need the vaccine, and we need to control and manage the disease at a reasonable level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are some really great points. Now, whenever we discuss vaccines, the term herd immunity tends to repeat itself. Can you tell us a bit more about what herd immunity is?
Great question. So similar to it, building up on what I said before, is we need people to be vaccinated. So when people are vaccinated, either they don't develop the disease or they're unable to pass it on to someone else. So basically, if a virus is there, it would take a host, and then after infecting that host, if the virus cannot find another host, and basically it dies. So there is no host that it can go to. And when we're talking about the herd immunity, we want to make sure that there are enough people vaccinated in the community so that even if someone who cannot get the vaccine or who didn't get the vaccine for any reason, they are not able to pass it on to someone else to continue the circulation of the virus. So it really depends on the number of people that are vaccinated to achieve that herd immunity level. And if there's a significant number of population that's vaccinated, the virus cannot circulate and then basically just dies with the last host.
Mm-hmm. So now that we have a better understanding of herd immunity, what percentage of the population will need to be vaccinated in order to reach herd immunity against COVID?
So that's a great question. And I think it's a still evolving question. And the right answer is we don't know how many people we need to achieve that herd immunity. It is the function of how infectious the virus is and how quickly it can transmit it to another person. So with the initial COVID cases, what we have seen is, yes, it spreads very quickly in certain environment, but now we are seeing some variants of concerns in Canada, in Ontario, and even in our region, which is making the disease spread very quickly. And when these happen, we need more people to be vaccinated. When this happens less, we need less people to get vaccinated. So initial estimate where we need at least 70% of the people vaccinated to achieve that herd immunity. But the real answer is we don't know. Maybe it could be 80% or 90% at this time. The hope is with all the vaccine making it available for all the residents in Canada, anyone who wants the vaccine, they should be able to get the vaccine. And we hope that the majority will take the vaccine and we'll get to the level where we can achieve that herd immunity.
Great. So at this point, I'd like to take a few seconds to go through the timeline of the COVID vaccine development. In January of 2020, both Pfizer and Mrna began developing their own versions of an mRNA-based COVID vaccine. In December of that same year, both companies had completed and published all phases of their clinical trials. Because of this historic speed of vaccine development, many are left with the question, were these vaccines rushed, and were there any shortcuts taken along the way?
Great question. So the vaccines that got their approval, and I think we heard a lot about the mRNA-based vaccine and the benefit of having these mRNA-based vaccine, and I think that's really helped to move things along very quickly. When COVID started to spread in a global pandemic with many, many countries getting affected and a lot of people getting infected with COVID, they realized that we need to do something really quickly to make sure that we have some kind of protection against it. So instead of following the same protocol, there were some regulatory consideration that was given that supported the application of these type of trials and approval of moving forward with some of these trials to conduct it for human trials. When Health Canada is reviewing all this data, there is no shortcut that they took. They went through the same process. The only benefit is what they call it as a rolling review. So initially, when a drug is approved or when a vaccine is approved, they have to have all the data, and then they send a big list of all the research and everything to the regulatory authority for consideration and review. And then the dialogue goes back and forth, and then they figure out, we need more information on this, we need more information on that. What helped to expedite this review is the companies continue to send the data as they continue to research. So it helped the Health Canada and the regulatory authorities to have an ongoing review of all the data. So by the time when all these clinical trials are completed, they were able to have ask the additional question on an ongoing basis, as well as in the end, to make sure that they are not compromising on the safety of the vaccine. This is really critical for the safety of our community, our people. And also as the regulatory authority, they want to make sure that it follows the same process. The rolling review allowed the process to complete quickly in a timely manner, and the companies who went through the trial process, they also were in different phases of the trial, and even there are some other trials that are ongoing. So we may see some additional guidance or some additional population included in this clinical data that would help us to make our decisions.
Mm-hmm. So how successful exactly does a vaccine have to be during the clinical trial period for it to be considered effective?
Well, there are, again, depending on the type of vaccine and depending on the type of disease that we are concerned about, at a minimum, we can anticipate that the vaccine has some protection, some level of protection, 30%, 40%, or 50%. So it has to have some kind of a threshold that qualifies them to even further review. If someone is submitting a clinical trial data with 15, 20%, which you can argue that, well, is it really effective, or is it maybe just by chance of an error, and how much risk we are willing to take based on that error? And then the severity of the disease. If the disease is really, really severe, even if you're protecting 20% of the people, that's a lot of life saved. But when you're talking about a widespread disease like this, and the clinical data that we have seen so far with the mRNA-based vaccine, those are all in 90% plus effectiveness, which is really, really great for a vaccine. So there are certain criteria. I believe, I want to say at least the minimum even to be considered for review was 20%. But most of the vaccine that we are seeing in Canada that's approved at this time is more than 90% effective.
That's really good news. Now, based on the factors that we've discussed, were these vaccines approved too quickly by the Canadian government?
Not at all. I think, as I explained earlier, that they did their rolling review, which allowed them to quickly look at the data on an ongoing basis. And as we are speaking, the data for many of these vaccines were submitted 2-3 months ago, and maybe we were not aware of it, but the rolling review was happening, and they were waiting for the final set of data before they get their final approval. So similar process was used, and there was no shortcuts taken to get the approval in place, and it followed through all the regular procedure that they normally do.
Great. So another question that we received a lot from our audience is, can children take this vaccine?
Great question. At this time, when clinical trial data is submitted to any regulatory authority, they have to have a certain level of protection for people because it's a new vaccine. So in clinical trial, generally they want to include adults in those clinical trial and to monitor how they react to the vaccine and the benefit and all of that things that are monitored in the adult population. It doesn't necessarily include children. So in most of these new vaccines, you will always see that it's indicated for adults and on a very specific population if the disease is affecting their specific population. So based on the clinical trial data, there was no one who was under the age of 18 for the, I believe, for the Mrna vaccine. And for Pfizer, there was no one under the age of 16. So that's why we don't have any data. But that doesn't mean that the vaccine will not be effective to it. The only thing that we can say is most likely the vaccine will be effective. But if you're really looking for the data, we have to wait for that data before it comes. So anyone in that younger age group, if they're looking to get the vaccine, we'll have to wait for the regulatory authorities' approval to say, yep, we have seen the data and it's safe to proceed with the younger children. But we know the immune system, the way it reacts, it should be safe for the children as well.
All right. Now, one of our Facebook commenters added that in local news, there was a report of a patient that passed away after receiving the COVID vaccine. Can you address this?
So some of this question, I think Dr. Kwan also addressed with respect to the vaccine and some of the reaction that we may see with the vaccine. At this point, all I can say is the investigation is ongoing. We don't have a confirmation that this death happened because of the vaccine, but there are some serious events that could happen, especially in people who have a severe anaphylactic reaction to any previous vaccines or a history of anaphylaxis in those situations. And that's why it is always indicated that when people are getting the vaccine and if they have any history of any allergies, they should consult with their healthcare provider to get a better sense of what exactly the allergies mean. because for some, it could be a seasonal allergy. Like I cough and sneeze during springtime. That doesn't mean that I shouldn't get the vaccine. But there may be similar allergies, which could be life-threatening allergies, where people really start to feel that they cannot breathe and they get severe reaction. Those are the people that we are generally concerned about. But if you have any type of vaccine, the best thing is you connect with your healthcare provider who know your medical history and will provide you the best evidence that, whether it would be helpful for you or not.
Mm-hmm. All right. So in recent news, over the past few weeks, Canada has experienced some delays in vaccine shipments. So does the vaccine still work if there's an extended period of time between the two doses?
Great question. And I think it's, so what happens with the vaccine is, especially with the multi-dose vaccine, you get your first dose of the vaccine that triggers your immune system to develop antibodies against that particular spike protein or the whatever you're introducing into the body to for the antibodies to fight for. So that triggers the reaction. What happens is when that reaction is triggered, we're looking for the type of immunity, whether it's a T-cell mediated immunity or whether it's the antibodies that are the immediate one that's being generated. And then the second question comes in, how long these antibodies last in the body? And the second dose for any vaccine when we are giving, we are basically trying to give a booster to the system, and that helps to prolong these antibodies. Most vaccines are indicated that you get your first dose, and then after 4 weeks, you get another dose so that it boosts your immune system to make sure that it remembers that what they dealt with, and it just stays for a longer period of time. If you're looking at the clinical trial data, some of these vaccines are even effective just by one dose. The only challenge is we don't know how long it can stay for up to 12 weeks. As UK, they have approved the vaccine to get between the first and second dose to get delayed for up to 12 weeks. Canada, we are just strictly following what so far with the Pfizer recommendation, the manufacturer. But generally speaking, the vaccine, if you're delaying it, it doesn't affect at all in terms of the safety and effectiveness of the vaccine. If you're getting the second dose at a time earlier than the scheduled dose, then you may not get the same type of booster effect that you are looking for. So a delay, generally speaking, it doesn't matter that much, but we also have to be mindful that how long we are delaying. It doesn't matter that you get your first dose now and 6 months down the road, you want to get your second dose. Probably you want to tweak that, but if it's delayed by a week or two, not an issue. But right now, we're following what the ministry is providing the guidance for. For Pfizer, the second dose is stretched up to 35 days. For Mrna, it's still 28 days unless it's contraindicated because of your clinical condition, if you're not feeling better, and if you're sick for any reason.
That's really good to know. So another one of our popular audience questions has been, will I still need to wear a mask and social distance after taking the vaccine? In other words, is it possible to still transmit the virus after being vaccinated?
Yeah, so another great question. And I think it's being the scientist in me, I would say we don't have lots of evidence to say confidently that, yeah, you don't need the mask. Generally speaking, that should be the case. But because this is still a new virus, this is still a new vaccine that we are dealing with. So we'd like to see more data to feel more confident and say, yep, this is exactly what it is. And also, when we are seeing the variants of concern, we don't know if the variation, if it would make these vaccines ineffective. So far, there's no data to suggest that the vaccines are ineffective on all these the mutated viruses. So we'll have to wait and see how it changes. The reason for ensuring that the public health measures continue to be in place to avoid these type of mutations and infecting people. So far, we'll still have to continue, at least until we get to the point and say confidently that we don't need to follow these public health measures. Until then, we all have to be in the same boat and continue to follow all those public health measures.
Perfect. And as my final question to you this evening, will the COVID-19 vaccine end the pandemic?
That's I don't know, $1 billion question or $1 billion question. That's where the hope is, that once we get enough people vaccinated, we should be able to see the end of the pandemic. And when we are saying that pandemic is basically, it's spreading everywhere. And going back to your first question or second question about herd immunity, so we have enough people vaccinated. And even let's say if we don't get the 100% people vaccinated, but if we have enough people vaccinated, we will break the chain of transmission. When we are breaking that chain of transmission, the virus is unable to find a host and the virus is unable to circulate, then we should be able to get rid of this pandemic. The challenge with these type of coronavirus is their ability to change its shape and structure. And if it makes that the vaccine is not useful, then we'll be in trouble. But influenza virus is much more notorious for changing its structure, and that's why we need this vaccine every year. The coronavirus, by default, it's not the same. We are only seeing some of these mutations because there's widespread transmission happening. Once we get a better handle on these transmission, we hope that it should bring the cases up to a point that we don't have to worry about it. It may still exist, but we don't have to worry about it, but it may take some time. We need a certain number of people vaccinated to reach herd immunity before we can say that confidently.
Perfect. Dr. Ahmed, it's been an absolute pleasure having you with us this evening. Thank you for always making time to participate in these important discussions with our community, and that goes to our entire panel this evening. Before I pass it off to Dr. Lisa Porter, I'd like to thank her for her role in COVID-19 research. As an executive director of WeSpark Health Institute, she sits on a number of provincial and national COVID-19 tables. And locally, she collaborates with Dr. Rahim, Dr. Tong, Dr. Kwan, and many others to optimize rapid detection of the virus within our community. Thank you for the work that you do, and thank you for your help in organizing our event this evening. With that, I'd like to pass it off to Dr. Lisa Porter with the closing remarks for this evening.
Thank you, Zainab, and thank you to all our panelists, Dr. Karpowicz, Trant, Rahim, Kwan, and Ahmed, for providing us with the fact-based knowledge that we need to make the decisions about our health and the health of our families. Congratulations to the WeSpark team and our student hosts. Special thanks to Zainab for her leadership in this event here today. A job well done. If you have family or friends that were unable to attend this event, this webinar will be recorded and available under the video tab on the WeSpark Facebook page. So I hope you will like our site, pass it around to friends and family, and liking our site will also keep you current on other events and news that are happening in the health research area. If we were unable to get to your question in the chat, we'll also follow up with our panel and provide answers in the Facebook chat below the video. So don't fear, we will get to you. COVID has affected us all in ways that we would have never imagined. We all have had a role to play, whether you're a frontline worker or an essential worker, everything from wearing a mask, observing social distancing, and dealing with the stresses that COVID has brought to your life. It's been a very long year, but every effort that all of you have made have contributed towards saving lives. The vaccine has definitely provided a light at the end of the tunnel, but as you've heard on the webinar, our job isn't done. We still have a little ways to go before that will be successful. We do have a responsibility to pass along the facts that you've heard here today, to ensure that our family and friends know where to look for the best information, and that we continue to work together as a community. We will get through this together. So have a great weekend, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.